Hi and welcome to the Inquendo Guitars Workshop. My name is Daniel and in this video I'm going to show you my process of fretting and fretwork on these two necks I've been working on. The first thing I need to do, of course, is recut the two fret slots where the inlay is, and I have to cut through the two guide pins I used to glue on the fretboard. And what I like to do to cut through my inlay is I take my jeweler saw with a little less tension than normal and a slightly coarser and heavier blade in it, so I can follow along the existing line of the fret slot a bit easier, I think, than using a fret slotting saw. And to finish off the fret slots, I'm going to use an older fret slotting saw so I can get the correct width and depth of my fret slots, and of course the same goes for the two guide pins. So the fret slots are recut, and luckily the next job is much more straightforward, and I'm going to take a triangular file, just a simple small triangular file, and I'm going to run it across each fret slot. And this is just to create a small bevel at the edges of the fret slot, so it makes it easier to put in the frets, hopefully, and it should prevent tear out when at some point in the future when the guitar needs to be refretted. It prevents tear out on the edges of the fret slot. So small little step, but very important to do, is just to create a small little bevel at the edges of your fret slot. Be aware for the utmost edges of the fretboard. It's very easy to go too deep at the far end by pointing your file down too much. Try to keep it somewhat at a tangent with the fretboard. So, and when I'm near the inlay, or when I'm at the inlay, I take some extra care, especially on the aluminium part or aluminum part, to make a nice bevel in the aluminum. And sometimes I take out an even smaller, finer file and make sure there's no burr or anything left from recutting the fret slot. They look great, aluminum inlays, but they add a whole new challenge when it comes to fret slots and fretting. Next step is to clean the fret slots, and you can buy specialized tools to clean the fret slots, and especially if you have a neck with binding, these specialized tools can be helpful. I made a tool myself, and I just took a feeler gauge I seldomly use. It's a 0.4mm feeler gauge that fits nicely in the fret slot, and I hope it shows up on camera, but I took a little triangular file and I made some notches, very small notches in the side of the feeler gauge, and now I can run this through a fret slot and make sure, and I can hear it by the sound just a little, and make sure there's no more dust and debris inside the fret slot. This job should be fairly easy, just remove the dust and then I can prepare the frets and start putting in some frets. Next step is preparing your fret wire, and here it depends a little on your situation how you buy your fret wire. You can buy sets of single frets, you can buy them at a length of about 1/2 meter or 1.5 foot, I think, or like me, have a huge roll of fret wire that you have to cut to length yourself. And besides cutting the frets to length, you also need to take the radius into account. Your fret wire has to have a similar or a slightly smaller radius as your fretboard has, and my fretboards have a radius of 12 inch, so I need to put a radius in my fret wire of about 10, 11 inch, and I'm going to do that with a very simple fret wire radius jig. You can buy these from several suppliers, but they're very easy to make, and I'm going to show you real quick how I made mine before I start putting in the radius of my fret wire. So let's take a look at my simple radius jig real quick, and it's very simple. It's just a piece of MDF, and at the bottom I have 2 sets, so 4 bearings in total, with a washer in between, and it's just bolted to the MDF using a couple of wing nuts, so I can adjust the tension on these washers just a little, but it's not even required. What is required is the top set of bearings, again with a washer in between, that needs to be adjustable up and down so you can adjust the radius you're making. And what I've did is very simple. I've made a big cavity in the back of my jig, added a wooden block with a bolt all the way through where the bearings are attached to, a bolt upside down through the pieces of MDF, and a thumb wheel here that I can use to pull the bearing assembly up, and when I twist it the other way, it pushes the bearing down. That's the only thing that's a bit counterintuitive. By tightening it, it pulls it up, and the other way around, it pushes the bearing down. But this allows me to take a piece of fret wire that needs to be radiused. I can put the tang of the fret wire in between the bearings, so the tang won't damage because it's riding in between the bearings. Now I can put in my fret wire, tighten the top bearing, so push it into the fret wire, and just run the fret wire through, and now you can see it gets a smaller radius. I can tighten it again. I like to do it in a couple of steps. Until I have the required radius. This might be a bit hard to see on camera, but due to the radius jig and the fact you can't radius your fret wire all the way to the end, you always end up with 1.5 centimeters, so just over half an inch of a straight piece of fret wire, and it's better not to use this on your fretboard. It makes it harder to get your frets in. So what I like to do, just to be certain, remove the first couple of centimeters or the inch on each side of the fret wire, just to be safe. So a little bit on cutting fret wire. Just in case this is the first time you're cutting your own fret wire. Here's the tang of the fret, and when cutting the fret you don't want to damage the tang too much. So a trick is to cut your fret wire with the tang parallel to the cutting edge of your pliers or your fret cutters, and this way you won't damage the fret wire or the tang. If you cut it like this, so with your tang of the frets touching your cutting edge of your fret cutters, and this is very hard fret wire, but then you in the best case you compress the tang. In the worst case you bend it over and you've got an unusable piece of fret wire, and that could be bad. Now that the fret wire has the correct radius, I can cut the frets to length, and I used to do this one thread at a time. So cut one thread, put it in, cut the next one, put the next one in, and so on. But now that I'm doing 2 necks, I made a little jig, just a piece of pine with 24 holes in it, so I can cut both sets of frets for both necks and then go over to the press and press them in. Well, cutting them to length, fairly easy. I take my neck and I take a piece of fret wire, measure it on the neck, keep a bit of length at both sides, and well, I'm going to need 2, so 1 and 2, and only 46 left to go. So I'm at the fret press and I've got my frets here ready to go. And you don't need a fret press. I use a fret press because it's supposed to be quicker and a little bit more accurate. But of course, using a fret hammer is also a very good option. You don't need a fret press. It just makes life a bit more easy, so to say. Yeah, I made an addition to my press, and I made this little table so I can hopefully keep my neck in position a little more easy. I got a caul to support the neck, yeah, and my frets, so I'm ready to go. So besides using the fret press, I thought it would be nice to show you how you can do it yourself using a fretting hammer. And what I used to do was just press in the fret slightly as far as it would go, tap in one end and the other end, and make sure when using a fretting hammer your neck is well supported, and this is above the heel, so it's always well supported. And I like to put in one side, if it would go in, that would be nice. Hammer in the other side, the middle, and go to each side. So, and then you check if it's flush with the fretboard. You can use your nail, or you can take a look, but sometimes the shadow and reflection, it might seem that there is a gap while there isn't any. And then, of course, I always like to cut off the excess straight away, so you can't hurt yourself and you still have some room for your fret end cutters. And what I always like to do is, when I've cut the ends of the frets, make sure it didn't lift out due to the compression from your cutters. But this seems nice, and this is how you can do it using a hammer instead of a fretting press. So of course, if you have a fretting press, it makes a lot less noise and it should be a little more accurate, so they say. And using the press is also something I still need to practice. But it is a lot less noisy. All the frets are in, and you might be wondering, well, hey Daniel, you didn't use any glue on your fret tang or in the fret slot when you pressed in the frets. And yeah, I must say you are correct. I don't use any glue when putting in the frets, and that has a couple of reasons I like to explain a bit. First off, I think when you have correct cut fret slots, glue isn't really necessary. The barbs should hold the frets in place more than sufficiently, and you might even have seen me struggle sometimes to get the frets in because of the very tight fret slot. So that's one reason. The other reason is we have still a very nicely polished fretboard, and I think when you're fiddling around with super glue in your frets, most of the times super glue will end up all over your fretboard, and you have to spend a lot of time cleaning it up and getting it nice and polished again. I like to use a different technique though. I do fill the little gaps underneath the frets that might be there, and I use a technique, and I think it's also been used, or maybe it's still being used, by PRS, by Paul Reed Smith guitars, and that's by dripping in very tiny beads of super glue from the sides of the fretboard, and in this way I have a minimum chance of spilling super glue onto my nicely polished and clean fretboard. So, and I rather spend time very gently dripping in a bit of super glue from the sides of the neck than spend ages getting my neck and fretboard the way it is now, so nice and clean. I'm going to use a very low viscosity or a medium viscosity super glue, and it takes a while to dry and to harden, but super glue will harden on its own when dripped in from the side. So I'm going to take my favorite tool, a toothpick or a cocktail stick, and very gently drip in some glue from the sides underneath the frets. When you apply just a tiny drop of super glue, you can see the super glue gets sucked into the fret slot. And I keep repeating this process until I see that the super glue is no longer been sucked in to the fret slot, and there's a nice little bubble of super glue left on top of the fret slot. That means that the fret slot is filled with super glue, and then I put just a little bit of dust, in this case ebony dust, onto the bubble and get a nice and clean result once the sides of the fretboard is sanded. So, and usually I do, of course, all the frets together. So put a drop of glue on each one and go back and forth until all the frets are filled, all the fret slots are filled, and then apply dust where I no longer see the super glue is being sucked into the fret slot, and only if a couple still need some more glue I keep filling them up until they're also full. And now you can see this one is full. Glue is no longer being sucked into the fret slot, and I can apply a bit of dust. And of course this will be sanded away at the same time as the sides of the frets. So let me do them all. So this may seem like a messy process and time consuming, and it is a little time consuming. It took me just over an hour to do, but as you can see, hopefully I still have a very nice and clean fretboard, and even the mess on the side is not as bad as you would think if you're very careful with dripping the super glue into the fret slots. So there's only a couple of bumps with a bit of super glue and dust, and of course the fret ends are all still very sharp. That's easily resolved with or a fret end file, or of course your leveling beams and some sandpaper. I usually start off with the file and just run it across the frets. And once I'm almost there, I'm going to take a leveling beam with 120 and 220 sandpaper. And I'm going to sand until all the super glue has disappeared and I've got a nice side of the fretboard. So this is the before, and I hope it shows up on camera, all the little bits of super glue and dust. And this is what it looks like after sanding. Nice and smooth and clean, and like I said, no mess at all on the fretboard. It's still nicely polished. My next step, and it isn't related to fretwork, but it has to do with the neck, is making the side dots, and it's a fairly easy process and I'm going to address it real quick. I'm using again aluminum for my side dots, and it's just a piece of 2mm aluminum wire, but you can also use plastic or whatever material you fancy using for your side dots, but make sure it's rather small, so 2mm in my case. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to measure out the positions I want my side dots to be in with my handy little protractor. Drill a 2mm hole, put in a drop of super glue, put in a piece of the aluminum wire, cut it and give it a little tap with a hammer so the aluminum will expand just a little, so it's nice and tight in the little hole I drilled. And once they're all in, I'm going to take out my leveling beam again and sand them flush with the side of the fretboard. So very quick and easy job to do, and it's something I really enjoy doing. So yeah, let's do it. So the side dots are in, and I'm going to do the other neck off camera, and I'll be right back to start putting the bevel on the sides of the frets. Now that the side dots are also in the second neck, it's time to start the actual fretwork, and I start by putting on a bevel on the edges of the frets, and usually it's a 35-degree angle. That's, I believe, most common, and you can buy specialized tools that have a file at the correct angle that you can run across your neck to bevel the edges. I like to use just my leveling beams and do it by eye, and I'm using several grids of sandpaper, 120, 220 and 320 grit sandpaper. And what I like to do is start putting on the bevel with the coarsest grit until I almost touch the edge of the fretboard, and then I'm switching over to a lighter grit, a finer grit, sand it again until I just hit the edge, the sharp corner of the fretboard, and then use the finest grit to just break the sharp edge and give it a rounded over feel, but just barely touching it. Don't overdo it. Just when you're at the edge of your fret, just give it a couple of passes with a light sandpaper just to break the sharp edge of the fretboard. So I'm going to try and give you guys a better camera angle so you can see what I'm doing. So make sure your neck is clamped to your workbench or your working area. Take your leveling beam with the coarsest grit sandpaper, put it at the angle you like, and I guesstimate it to be around between 45 and 30 degrees, so it's somewhere around 35 degrees, and just run your sanding beam along the frets. I like to sand just in a single direction and try to keep an eye on the consistency of the bevel. That's one side. And I hope this shows up on camera that the bevel is all the way up to the edge of the fretboard. Let's do the other side. Now that we have a nice bevel on the sides of our frets, there still are some sharp edges which you can feel if you run your hand across the frets. So before I start leveling the frets and crowning them and such, I'm going to take off the very outermost edge, the sharp point of the edge of the bevel, so to say, with one of these fret end dressing files. And you have a couple of types. I'm using the crimson ones. This is a very small one and a very fine one. I like this one a lot. And there's the other one. It's a bit bigger and a bit coarser. The main thing is about fret end dressing files that it has two polished sides. It has a rounded over polished side and a flat side. Same goes for the tiny one. This is rounded over and this is flat. And at this point you want to use the flat side of your fret end dressing file, and without masking the fretboard, because we're going to need to be at the very tip of this bevel, and just take your file and knock off the corner. So you can't feel any sharp edge anymore. This is sufficient enough for most fret jobs, and what they usually do is just run the fret file across to get rid of the sharp edge of the entire bevel, and this is usually enough. And you can maybe even do it some more by using the rounded over side, and this would be a nicely addressed fret end. I usually do a very extreme version of this. I really like to round over the entire end of the fret. So I'm going to take it a bit further, a bit into extremes, to round over the entire fret end to create my bullet type fret ends. Something like this. Really extreme round over. So yeah, let me do all the frets and I come back to you when it's time to level the frets. After knocking off all the corners from the frets with the front end dressing file, I like to do the following. I like to take a piece of 320 grit sandpaper, wrap it somewhat around my finger and give the edge, the sharp edge, a nice sand. And you can even take your sandpaper in between the frets, lightly round over the edge of the fretboard to give it a nice and comfortable feel. And I try not to overdo it. I don't want it to feel worn. I still want it to feel like a new neck, but only very comfortable to play. So yeah, it takes a bit of finesse, and yeah, you can do this to taste. Yeah, very comfortable. Let's do the other side. Yeah, it makes a real difference to just take a bit of sandpaper and treat the edges of your fretboard. So the next step is crucial to get a nice playing guitar neck and have a good fret job, is making sure that my neck is absolutely dead straight. And to do that, I've clamped my neck to the workbench so it's nice and stable. I'm going to take my notch straight edge, place it on the fretboard and use an Allen key to adjust the truss rod if necessary. And my neck is perfectly straight already, so I didn't have to adjust anything. But when you need to adjust your truss rod, I recommend after adjusting to wait just a couple of minutes, get a cup of coffee, wait 10-15 minutes and recheck your neck, because I've noticed that sometimes there is a bit of a delay, if you call it like that, where the truss rod and the neck needs time to settle in the final position, especially when you're using carbon rods, so carbon reinforcement rods in your neck. Sometimes it might take a while for the neck to settle in its final position. So with this done, I'm now going to mask off the fretboard with some masking tape to prevent any damage. Well, and of course, masking off the fretboard is fairly easy. You can just mask it. Now it's time to start leveling these frets, and I've put some fresh sheets of sandpaper on my leveling beam. It's 120 grit sandpaper, 320 grit, and on my shorter one I have a fresh sheet of 240 grit sandpaper. I usually start with just 120 just to see how much I need to take off, and if I don't have to take much off at all, I quickly switch to as fine a grit as possible. But first I'm going to take a permanent marker, and doesn't matter which color, and just mark the tops of all of the frets. And this allows me to keep track of what I'm doing during leveling. So, and now that the tops of all the frets are marked, I always like to support my neck during leveling, although I'm not going to use much force for leveling. I take my leveling beam with, like I said, 120 grit sandpaper or something like it, and gently place it on the frets and just run it across, trying to keep it as parallel to the center line of the neck as possible. And now I can already see my 11th and 12th fret are starting to show scratches, and same goes for my 1st fret and my 24th. So I need some leveling, and 120 grit might be a bit coarse, but let's see. And with each pass I'm moving my leveling beam first to one side of the fretboard and then to the other. So do a pass in the center line, do a pass right next to it, and keep going until the side of this side of the fretboard, and then do the other side. And I'm just using the weight of the leveling beam. If you look closely, and hope it shows up on camera, you can see that there are scratches appearing in the blue marker on these frets, and especially the 11th and the 12th frets are already sanded down a little, and that means that these two frets at least are high in comparison to the other one, because as soon as they are starting to level out, I should see scratches appearing evenly on each fret, and when all the marker, or at least if I see scratches on the top of each fret, that means that the frets are level and I can start re-crowning. So I keep using the sanding beam, and I might switch over to a finer grit and keep using the leveling beam until all the marker disappears from the top of the frets. So I'm sorry for the background noise, but one of my neighbors is just started to use a power washer. So if you hear any background noise, my apologies. So now that I've removed all the marker, or at least there's no more marker at the top of the frets, I'm going to use something that's called a fret rocker, and it's just a piece of metal with a couple of straight edges, and that allows me to check all the frets if they're level and compared to their two neighbors. And by checking it across over the whole width of the neck, I can check if these are all the same height, because as soon as one fret is lower or higher than one of its neighbors, the fret rocker will rock, indicating a high spot, for example here. That could mean that this fret is higher than this one or the other one, but judging on the amount of marker still left on this fret, I think this one is a bit lower in comparison to the rest, so I will have to do some more sanding. And sometimes when I have just a single spot that's giving me some troubles, I sometimes just mark it and use my fret end dressing file to do a little spot leveling. That fixes it. And I keep repeating this process of using the fret rocker and maybe this leveling beam with very fine sandpaper and some spot leveling until I have no more rock with the fret rocker, and then I know all the frets should be the same height and it should be nice and level, and then we can start doing a bit of a fall off for the last frets and then start re-crowning these now nasty looking frets. So now that I've confirmed that my frets are all nice and level and there's no more rock with the fret rocker, I'm going to make a, what's it called? A fall off of a fall away on the last couple of frets, so 24 to about 17. I'm going to sand them at a slight downwards angle, and in theory this allows for a lower action because you can compensate for the oscillation of the string or the vibration of the string while you're playing by having just a slight fall away at these higher frets. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to mark off these frets once more, so 24 to 17. I'm going to mark them with my marker. That's 17, yeah. And I'm going to put 2 layers of masking tape, and I'm using very thin masking tape, on the 12th fret. Just stick it on there, 1, and 2. And I'm also going to mask off half of my leveling beam, and I'm going to use a fine grit. Not exactly halfway, but it'll do as long as I keep the masked off section above the 12th fret, so I don't wear through my masking tape. And I'm going to do the same. I'm going back and forth over the entire width of the neck until once again all the newly applied marker has disappeared, and this should give me the slightest angle on these last 7 frets. So it doesn't take much, and of course check it again with the trusty fret rocker. Very nice. Yeah, I always take my time making sure everything is nicely leveled, and because I think this is one of the, if not the most important part of building a guitar, is making sure that it plays absolutely fantastic. And yeah, what determines the playability of a guitar is of course the fretwork and the fretboard. So I take my time doing this correctly and making sure I've got it perfect. I'm very happy with how this one is turning out. So it's time to start re-crowning the frets. What do I mean with re-crowning the frets, for those who are not familiar with the term? Of course, after leveling the frets, we ended up with flat tops on each of our frets there. Especially my 12th fret is really flat on top. And a nice playing guitar with the best intonation has as round as frets as possible to have a minimum amount of surface area touching the strings when playing. So of course we have to re-round or re-crown these frets. I'm using a re-crowning fret file or a re-crowning file, and it's just basically a triangular file where the sharp edges are grounded off and they're nice and polished and rounded over to not damage the fretboard. There are specialized re-crowning files that are concave or convex, concave I believe, files that run over the fret and creates a nicely rounded top on the fret. Yeah, I don't use those. I like to use just a regular triangular file. And the way you go about recrowning a fret, and I'm going to take this one as an example because it's nice and flat on the top. I'm going to mark it once again with a marker, and I'm going to place my fret file up against the fret, taking of course into account the radius of the fretboard, and I'm going to, as good as I can, run it parallel up against the fret and just remove a tiny bit of the marker on one side. Then I'm going to the other side, doing exactly the same. And first of all, I'm going to try and make it nice and straight, so I've got two parallel edges on the top. And with each pass, I'm going to slightly rotate my file, so I very gently remove a section with each pass until I have a very thin line left over in the center of the fret. It doesn't require a lot of force. You can be very gentle if you're scared or if you're new to this. You can take it as slow as you want. Don't apply a lot of pressure on your fretting file, and try to keep your mark as centered as possible and as straight as possible. And sometimes the leveling causes the fret to wear uneven or is uneven, and then sometimes you have to focus more on one spot when one side is, for example, almost there. Yeah, it takes a bit of experience and practice, but it's something you can practice and get experience while doing, as long as you take it slow and are very careful with what you're doing. I'm done recrowning my frets, and as you can probably see, there's still the tiniest of blue lines left in the center of each fret, and from this point on I'm considering these lines sacred, because as long as I don't touch these lines, my frets should be nice and level. So before I can start polishing out the scratches left by the crowning file with various fine grits of sandpaper, I'm going to do a final fret end dressing with my little friend, the fret end dressing file. If you don't want to do any special bullet type style or rounded over fret ends, it must suffice. You can suffice with just passing over and just knocking off the sharp edge left by recrowning, and you should be fine. I, however, do my Unquendor style, bullet style fret ends, in which I really try to round over the entire fret end. And I just keep running my file across to make a nice, as nice as possible fret end. So something like this. Hopefully you can see it. It isn't hard to do. It just takes time and a keen eye to make sure it's nicely rounded over, and it's very small, so sometimes hard to see. I'm going to put on some music, I'm going to dress all the ends, and then I'll come back to you to explain you a little bit about polishing. After dressing the fret ends, I'm going to remove all the scratches left by the various files using a variety of grids of sandpaper, very high grids, starting at 400 and going to the grid 600, 1000, 1500 and 2000 grit sandpaper. And what I like to do, I like to roll up a small piece of sandpaper and making sure not to hit the blue line that's still on top of the frets. I'm going to try and polish out all the scratches left by the files. And yeah, of course this will take a while to do. And yeah, like with the fret end dressing, I'm going to put on some music and very carefully remove all the scratches. And as soon as I'm hitting the 1500 grit sandpaper, then I'm going to just very gently remove the scratches and the blue line on top of the fret. And yeah, and being real careful about it, not to remove too much. So this is what my frets look like after sanding up to 2000 grit, and they're nice and shiny already. But if you take a very close look, and I don't think this shows up on camera, there are still minute scratches on top of each fret, and that means, and that's for me an indicator that the frets are still level. And now you can really polish them using, for example, fret polishing rubbers. And usually when using 2000 grit sandpaper, the fine and the super fine should be enough. And you can place them on your fret. Give them a couple of wipes with fine and with super fine, until all the minute scratches are gone from the surface of the fret. And here is our polished fret. So you can use these fret polishing rubbers. I used to use them often, but these days I use a Dremel, and I'm going to show you that process next. So I had to remove my masking tape because it was too worn to be of any use any longer. Now I'm going to show you how I polish my frets using a Dremel, and it's just a Dremel with a polishing disc and some polishing compound. And I'm using just masking tape, just 2 strips, to protect my fretboard when polishing my frets. And of course you could also use those stainless steel fretboard protectors. Little strips with a slot inside you can place over your fret when polishing. I don't like using those because you have to hold them down or use a rubber band to keep them in place, and a piece of masking tape works just as good. So yeah, my Dremel is connected to a foot switch, nice and easy. Put a bit of polishing compound on the polishing disc. And just give the fret a quick polish. That's all there's to it, and it's much faster, much easier than using polishing rubbers. Let me give you a close-up. So this is the polished fret, real shiny. So let's do the other one, and I can just reuse these 2 strips for now. bit of compound. And that's it. There's a huge difference between these two frets. Let me do them all. So I'm done polishing all the frets, and here are some pictures of the end result. Yeah, and that hopefully shows you with some time and effort put in your fretwork, you can have a very nice result on your fretwork. And that's it for this week's video. Thank you very much for watching this long video. And yeah, if you liked it, like always, please leave a like, and if you have any questions, anything you want to share with me, leave a comment in the comment section down below. And if you're new to my channel and this is the first video you're watching of my channel, please consider subscribing and hitting that little notification bell to get notified when I upload something new. In next week's video I hope to finish these two necks finally by adding the headstock veneers, tuner holes, and of course the Equendor guitars logo inlay. So keep an eye out for that one on next Monday, and I hope to see you all there. But until then, have a nice week.